The hum of the station echoed through the narrow halls, a constant reminder of the fragile space humans had carved out in the cold void of space. On the observation deck, Ethan Carter, an experienced engineer, wiped his hands on his coveralls as he stared out into the stars. To him, the endless expanse was a quiet reminder of the vastness of the universe. But today, it felt oddly like a prison. He wasn't one for socializing, especially with the newcomers that had arrived from Valar, a distant planet that the humans had just begun to make contact with. Zira, a young Velari diplomat, stood near him, her luminous blue eyes glowing faintly. She was studying him carefully, her mind already starting to reach out, probing his thoughts. Her species had the unique ability to connect telepathically, sharing emotions and thoughts seamlessly. But this human was different. Unlike the other crew members she'd interacted with so far, Ethan was closed off, like a locked door that refused to open. She was told that humans were a bit tricky when it came to trust, but she hadn't expected this level of resistance. With her species, communication was effortless, an open exchange of feelings and ideas, no secrets. But Ethan, standing before her, made it clear that the human mind was an impenetrable fortress. "Why aren't you responding?" Zyra's voice was soft but curious, her words reaching Ethan's mind before they even left her mouth. She tried again, pushing slightly, but Ethan's mind was firmly shielded. Ethan jolted slightly, feeling the tug on his consciousness, and instinctively stepped back, his arms folding across his chest. He had no idea what she was doing, but he didn't like it. Telepathy. He wasn't having it. He wasn't some alien's experiment. He raised an eyebrow, his gaze meeting hers with a look of irritation. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was firm, bordering on annoyed. He hadn't signed up for any telepathic games, especially not from some alien species. Zira blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the intensity of his response. The humans she had met so far were friendly and open to communication. But this human, was different. She had expected at least some willingness to connect, but Ethan seemed like he wanted nothing to do with it. I am only trying to communicate," she said, her voice soft, though confusion lingered in her tone. "It is the way of my people, to bond through shared thoughts." Ethan didn't move. He stared at her, unsure of what to make of the alien woman before him. She looked human enough, with delicate features and shimmering skin, but there was something unmistakably foreign about her presence. And the telepathy. That was just too much. He'd spent years building up walls to protect his own mind, and he wasn't about to let some alien breach it, no matter how friendly she seemed. "Yeah, well, that's not going to happen," he said bluntly, stepping back further, his voice growing more serious. "I'm not some test subject for you to poke around in my head." Zyra's brow furrowed. She didn't understand. Why was this human being so resistant? She had tried to explain to him that bonding with her species was a way of forming trust, of creating a deeper connection. Yet his mind seemed impenetrable, like a locked door that refused to open. She wasn't used to this. In her world, there was no need for barriers. Emotions were shared freely, and thoughts were open, like a song that everyone could hear and sing along to. She took a small step closer, her heart racing slightly with the realization that this human might be more difficult than she had anticipated. "You are angry," she observed gently, reading the emotions swirling in his mind. "But I don't understand why." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He didn't like how easily she could read his emotions, even if she wasn't directly in his head. "You wouldn't understand. You're not human," he said, the words coming out sharp. Zira flinched, her telepathic senses picking up on the raw emotion behind his words. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something guarded. This human, Ethan, had secrets, painful ones. "I want to understand," she said softly, "but you have to let me." Ethan stood there, silently fuming. He didn't know what this alien wanted, but he wasn't about to let her in. His mind was his own, and he wasn't about to let some stranger, no matter how advanced or alien. Poke around in it. I don't need your help, Ethan muttered under his breath. I'll get the job done without anyone digging into my thoughts. Zira's eyes flickered with frustration. She had thought that reaching out would bring them closer, that they could begin building trust. But instead, she was met with resistance at every turn. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. No other species had ever closed themselves off so completely. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, an uneasy silence stretching between them. Zira wanted to try again, to reach out, to connect. But Ethan was firm in his resolve. There would be no bonding today. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ethan turned away. I need to get back to work, he said, his voice rough. Zira watched him go, her heart heavy. She couldn't help but wonder. Could she ever truly connect with this human? She was determined to find out. The next few days aboard the station were tense for Zira. Despite her best efforts to understand Ethan, every attempt at communication felt like hitting a brick wall. Whenever she tried to connect, whether through her telepathic abilities or simple conversation, he would either shut down or deflect her attempts with a few gruff words. It frustrated her. She had met many different species during her travels, each with its own way of thinking, but she had never encountered one like the humans. They were complicated, stubborn, and seemingly immune to the type of connection her people thrived on. Zira sat in her quarters late at night, reflecting on everything she had learned about the human species so far. Seiji, the station's artificial intelligence, had provided her with a wealth of information. Humans were emotional, yes, but they also kept a tight grip on their thoughts. Unlike the Velari, who shared everything in their minds, humans were intensely private, even with those they trusted. It was a cultural trait, Seiji had explained. Humans built their relationships through actions, not words or thoughts. But that didn't explain Ethan's behavior. Why was he so resistant? She thought about the way he had pulled away when she tried to connect with him on the observation deck. There had been anger in his eyes, but there had also been something deeper, something she couldn't quite reach. The next morning, Zira decided to try again. Ethan, she said softly, as she approached him in the station's engineering bay, where he was busy working on some repairs. I would like to understand you better. I believe we can learn from each other. Ethan didn't look up from the wires he was fiddling with, but she could see his body tense. He didn't speak for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether or not to answer. Finally, he muttered, "We've already done enough learning, don't you think?" Zira felt a flicker of something in his thoughts, something sharp and defensive. She knew that if she pushed too hard, he would retreat even further, but she couldn't give up. I don't mean to intrude, but she hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. I'm not asking for your thoughts, Ethan. I just want to understand how you see the world. Why are you so closed off? Ethan let out a heavy sigh and dropped his tools onto the workbench with a loud clang. He turned around to face her, his expression hard. You wouldn't understand, he said, his voice lower than before. Some things are better left alone. Zira stepped closer, her gaze softening. You're wrong. I've seen many things in my life, and I've learned that there is always room for understanding. No one should have to face the universe alone. For a moment, there was silence between them. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. But Zira could feel something in him shift. His defenses were still up, but they were wavering, just slightly. It was a small victory. I don't want your help, he said finally, his voice firmer this time. But there was a trace of something else, a hint of vulnerability, almost imperceptible. I'm just doing my job. I don't need you poking around in my mind, thinking you can fix everything. Zira's heart sank, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she nodded. I respect that. I'm not here to change you, Ethan, but I can offer you a chance to know me, to understand who I am. I can't promise you that it will be easy, but I think it could be worth it. Ethan crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes at her. And what do you want from me in return? Nothing, Zyra replied quickly. I just want to learn how to be more human. I don't expect anything in return. Ethan studied her for a moment, clearly skeptical. You're telling me that you want to learn how to be human, but you don't expect anything. That's not how it works. People don't give without expecting something in return. Zyra blinked. She had thought she understood humans, at least on some level, but this was a new perspective. She hadn't considered the human need for give and take in relationships. For the Velari, everything was shared freely, with no expectations, but she was learning that humans had different rules. Rules she would need to respect if she truly wanted to understand them. I suppose. Zyra paused, her mind working through the concept. I will need to adjust to that. But for now, just give me a chance. Let's work together, and maybe we can start with something simple. No pressure, no expectations. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, still wary, but something in his expression softened. All right, fine, he said finally. You want to understand me. Start by helping me finish this repair. I don't need any mind games, just a hand with the tools. Zyra smiled, the faintest spark of hope flickering inside her. I can do that. For the next hour, they worked side by side in silence, each focused on their task. Zyra could sense that Ethan was still guarded, still unsure of her motives, but for the first time, she felt like there was a crack in his walls. Slowly, over the course of their work, they began to communicate without words, passing tools, giving silent nods of approval, and even exchanging small smiles when something went right. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Zyra knew that earning Ethan's trust wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, they could figure out a way to connect, without the need for telepathy, without the need for words. Perhaps the human way, though strange, could work after all. And as they finished the repair and the station's systems hummed back to life, Zyra couldn't help but feel that this small victory was the beginning of something far greater. The days continued to pass quietly aboard the station, the hum of machinery and the software of the engines providing a constant background to the daily routines. Zyra and Ethan had begun to form an uneasy truce. They still didn't communicate much beyond the necessary tasks, but there was a kind of understanding that had begun to grow between them. Zyra could sense that Ethan was starting to lower his guard, just a little. She wasn't sure if it was because of her patience or because he had finally accepted that she wasn't going anywhere. But whatever the reason, it gave her hope. Ethan, for his part, had started to feel something unexpected, a strange curiosity about the Velari. He still wasn't ready to completely open up to her, but there was something about her presence that made him feel less alone in the vast, empty station. Her calm demeanor, her gentle way of speaking, even the way she moved, it was all so different from the people he was used to. And there was something undeniably comforting about it. The quiet was suddenly shattered one afternoon. The station's alarm system blared to life, followed by a loud, panicked voice over the comms. Meteor storm. Impact in 5 minutes. All crew report to the nearest safe zone. Zyra and Ethan exchanged a brief glance, both recognizing the seriousness of the situation. Without a word, Ethan moved quickly to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he checked the incoming storm's trajectory. The meteor storm was faster than expected, and the station's shields wouldn't be able to hold for long. Damn it. Ethan cursed under his breath as he tried to reroute the station's systems, but there wasn't enough time. The storm was too close. Ethan, we need to get to the evacuation pods, Zyra said, her voice calm but urgent. She could feel the tension building in the air, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his tools and started heading toward the escape pods, but just as he turned the corner, the station shook violently. A loud crashing noise echoed through the hallways as a meteor struck the side of the station, causing the walls to tremble. Zyra gasped and reached out instinctively, her telekinetic powers flaring to life as she stabilized herself. She glanced around, her eyes scanning for any immediate danger, but the real problem was the breach in the station's hull. It was too large to repair quickly, and if the storm kept up, the station's structure wouldn't survive much longer. "Ethan," she called out, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of metal groaning and alarms blaring. She spotted him ahead, already running toward the exit, but as she watched, another meteor hit the opposite side of the station, sending shockwaves through the structure. Ethan stumbled, falling to the ground with a loud crash. His body slammed against the floor, and for a moment, Zyra thought he was unconscious. Without thinking, she rushed toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached him just as another wave of shock hit the station, sending debris flying. Without hesitation, Zyra reached out with her telekinetic abilities, her mind connecting with Ethan's for the first time in a way that felt completely different from before. Instead of trying to force a bond, she simply reached out, her thoughts mixing with his for a moment, offering him strength. Her power wrapped around him like a protective shield, lifting him gently off the ground. She could feel the pulse of his heartbeat in her mind, his pain, his fear, and yet there was also something else, something deeper. There was a resolve within him that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just about survival. It was about fighting back. Zyra focused all her energy on helping him stand, the connection between them growing stronger, though she had not intended it. In that brief moment, she felt his thoughts align with hers, his determination, his will to live, his need to protect the people around him. The human spirit, Zyra realized, was far more resilient than she had ever imagined. Ethan blinked, shaking his head as he tried to focus. "Zyra." His voice was hoarse, but he seemed to be regaining his senses. What are you doing?" "I'm getting you out of here," she said simply, her voice steady. She could feel the station shaking, but she wasn't afraid. There was no room for fear now. All that mattered was getting to safety. Ethan's eyes widened as he looked around. The station's walls were cracking, and more debris began to fall around them. But instead of panic, there was a new clarity in his gaze. He didn't argue or try to stop her. His earlier resistance was gone, replaced by something else: trust. "All right," he said, his voice quieter now. "Let's move." With her telekinetic abilities holding him steady, Zyra guided Ethan toward the nearest escape pod. They moved quickly through the corridors, dodging falling debris and navigating the shaking hallways. Zyra's focus was sharp, her mind tuned to every shift in the station's structure, using her abilities to prevent anything from falling on them. But just as they reached the pod bay, disaster struck again. The station's artificial gravity systems failed, sending them both crashing to the floor. Zyra was thrown against the wall, her connection with Ethan momentarily lost as the sudden jolt knocked the wind out of her. Ethan, however, didn't hesitate. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her to her feet. "We don't have time for this," he shouted, his voice urgent. Zyra nodded, pushing herself up, and together they made it to the escape pod. Ethan slammed the hatch closed just as another shockwave rocked the station. The pod detached, and as they shot into space, Zyra looked back at the station, the crumbling structure now floating in the distance. Her heart pounded, but there was a strange sense of peace in knowing they had made it out. And as the stars stretched out before them, Zyra realized that something had shifted between them. In that moment of danger, they had shared something deep, something that neither telepathy nor words could fully explain. Perhaps this was the beginning of a real bond, one forged in the fire of survival, trust, and the undeniable strength of the human spirit. The days following the meteor storm were filled with repair work and brief moments of calm. But the quiet was deceptive. Ethan and Zyra found themselves working together more often. After the incident in the escape pod, there was a subtle shift in their relationship. The tension between them had eased, replaced with something almost like mutual respect. Zyra's telepathic abilities were still a mystery to Ethan, but something had changed in him. He wasn't so closed off anymore. He still wasn't ready to fully open up to her, but now when they spoke, it felt like they were finally starting to understand each other, at least a little. They worked side by side, fixing systems, realigning the station's shields, and even laughing about the oddities of life in space. But Zara still couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't quite reached Ethan. Despite their progress, his mind remained locked. Zara had tried again, just the night before. While Ethan slept, she attempted to make a connection. Light, gentle, with no intention of pushing too hard. Her species communicated effortlessly through telepathy, sharing thoughts, emotions, and even memories. But humans, as she had learned, kept their minds tightly sealed off. She reached out carefully, feeling the edges of his consciousness. At first, everything seemed normal, until she felt a wall, cold and unyielding. Ethan's thoughts were hidden behind layers of defense, and the more Zara tried to explore, the more she realized how intense and complex the human mind really was. There were emotions, yes, anger, fear, but also something deeper, something buried beneath the surface. But no matter how she tried, she couldn't reach it. The frustration she felt began to grow. How could she understand him if he wouldn't let her in? The next day, as they worked together in the control room, Zara's thoughts turned back to their last conversation. She had been so sure that humans were capable of connection, but with Ethan, it felt like she was trying to break through an impenetrable fortress. "Ethan," she said, her voice quiet but persistent, "why do you keep shutting me out?" Ethan didn't look up from the console in front of him. He was focused on the task at hand, as always. But there was a momentary pause before he answered, and when he did, his tone was different. Not angry, but tired. "I don't need anyone poking around in my head," he said, his voice flat. It's not something I want to share." Zara felt the sharpness of his words, but she didn't back down. She couldn't afford to. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Ethan. I want to understand. I want to help you." Ethan sighed and turned away from the console, leaning against the table with his arms crossed. "I don't need help," he muttered, glancing at her with a look of frustration. "I'm fine on my own. I've always been fine on my own." Zara's heart ached at his words. She could sense the walls in his mind, but now she was beginning to understand why they were there. Something had happened to Ethan, a deep, painful experience that had made him lock away everything. His thoughts, his feelings, everything. But what? "I know you're strong, Ethan," she said gently, her voice soft as she stepped closer. "But you don't have to carry everything alone. You don't have to shut people out." Ethan shook his head, clearly uncomfortable with the direction their conversation was taking. "You don't get it," he replied, almost angrily. "It's not about strength. It's about survival. I've had to learn to keep things to myself, to not trust anyone. That's how I survive." Zara was quiet for a moment, letting his words sink in. She could feel his pain through the edges of his thoughts, even though he tried to hide it. There was something haunting in the way he held himself, like he was carrying a burden that he couldn't share with anyone. "I think you're wrong," Zara said softly. "You don't have to carry it alone. You don't have to shut people out. Not anymore." Ethan's eyes flickered with something. Was it doubt? Hesitation? Zara wasn't sure, but she saw something in him shift, just a little. She didn't know if it was her words or the simple act of being there beside him, but in that moment, she felt like he was starting to open up, even if only a tiny crack. "I can't just forget everything," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice quieter now. "There are things I've seen, things I've done, things I've lost." Zara's heart broke at the pain in his voice. She had known that there was more to his guarded nature than just his stubbornness, but hearing it out loud made her realize just how deeply it went. Ethan wasn't just closed off to her. He was closed off to the world. "I don't expect you to forget," Zara said gently, "but you don't have to carry it alone. Let me help, even if just a little." Ethan was silent for a long time, his gaze distant as he processed her words. Zara gave him space, sensing that he needed time to work through his emotions. She didn't push. She couldn't force him to open up. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not good at trusting people. Not anymore." "I know," Zyra replied softly. "But trust isn't something you give all at once. It's something that grows, little by little. And I'm willing to wait." Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Zyra thought he was going to pull away. But instead, he gave her a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to get through to him. The days that followed were quieter than the storm that had nearly destroyed the station. Ethan and Zyra fell into a rhythm, working together without speaking much but silently understanding each other. There was still a distance between them, but it was slowly narrowing. While they hadn't yet become close friends, there was a sense of peace in their coexistence. The tension that had once been there now felt like something in the past, left behind with the dangers of the meteor storm. Ethan had started to let Zyra in small ways. When she offered to help with the repairs or data analysis, he no longer pushed her away. Instead, he welcomed the help, silently appreciating her presence. He'd stopped shutting her out as completely as he once did, and for Zyra, that was a small victory. One afternoon, as they worked in the observation room, Zyra gazed out the window, watching the stars drift past the station. The endless void stretched out before her, full of possibilities, but still, there was something about the quiet darkness that unsettled her. She felt the urge to speak. "Ethan, have you ever wondered what's beyond the stars?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Ethan, who had been sitting across from her, glanced up, clearly surprised by the question. He hesitated, as though unsure how to answer. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I've seen a lot of space, but I'm not sure if I've ever really wondered what's beyond it. Maybe it's just empty. Maybe nothing really matters beyond what we can see." Zyra turned to him, sensing a hint of sadness in his words. "I don't think it's empty. I think it's full of stories, of things waiting to be discovered." Ethan looked at her for a moment, his gaze softening. "Maybe. But stories are sometimes dangerous. They lead to things we don't want to face." Zyra felt the weight of his words. There was more behind his statement than he was willing to admit. There was something in his past, some story that had left its mark on him. She could feel it, like a shadow lurking in the background of his thoughts, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. But she didn't push. He wasn't ready yet. Instead, she smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I like to think that the stars have more to offer than just darkness. Maybe one day, I'll take you on a journey across the stars. It would be an adventure." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A journey across the stars? Huh. You must be pretty confident about that." Zyra chuckled softly. "I have a lot of faith in your skills. You know how to keep a ship running, even in the middle of nowhere." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. It was a small thing, but it felt like a breakthrough. Zyra's heart lifted. There was something in that smile, a glimpse of the man she was starting to see beneath the hardened exterior. Before she could say anything else, a sudden alarm blared throughout the station. The sharp sound sliced through the calm, pulling them both out of their brief moment of peace. They exchanged a quick look, both instantly alert. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, his voice low, as he rushed to the control panel. Zyra followed him quickly, her mind already racing. The station's sensors had picked up an unexpected signal, something unusual and out of place. A small vessel, possibly an enemy ship, was heading straight for them. "This is bad," Ethan muttered, pulling up the station's defensive systems. "We weren't expecting any visitors. Not like this." Zyra's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension rising in the air. She had no idea who or what was coming, but she knew they needed to prepare. The last thing they needed was another surprise attack. "We need to defend the station," she said, stepping closer to Ethan. "Activate the shield systems. I'll help with any external repairs if needed." Ethan nodded, his face set in determination. "You stay inside. I'll handle the shields." Get to the weapons systems if things go south. Zira hesitated but then nodded. She wasn't about to back down. She knew that Ethan's instincts were good, but she wasn't about to leave him to face whatever this was alone. Before she could protest, the ship's alarms went off again, this time more urgently. The enemy vessel had made its move. They had only minutes before it would be close enough to strike. "Ethan, let me help," she said again, her voice firm. "I can help you with the shields. You don't have to do everything on your own." Ethan's eyes flickered with something, perhaps appreciation, or maybe fear, but whatever it was, it softened his expression. For a moment, she saw the vulnerability beneath the tough exterior. "All right," he said, "but stay sharp. We don't know who or what we're dealing with." As they worked together, Zira felt the tension in the air grow thick. Ethan's quick movements and steady hands at the controls were a testament to his skill, but even he was starting to feel the pressure. The ship's hull vibrated as the enemy vessel drew closer, its intent unknown but undeniable. Zira reached out with her telepathic abilities, trying to sense what was coming. She could feel a sharp presence, cold and calculating, like a predator. Whoever was in that ship was not someone to take lightly. But there was something else too, something familiar in the energy she was picking up. Suddenly, the comms crackled to life, and a voice echoed through the station. "This is Captain Allura of the Shadows of Kira," the voice said, cold and distant. "We've been tracking your station for weeks. You've been identified as a threat. Prepare to be boarded." Zira froze, her mind racing. The Shadows of Kira, a rogue faction of mercenaries that had terrorized the outer reaches of space. She had heard stories about them, but to hear their names spoken out loud was chilling. Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands tightening on the controls. "Looks like we got a fight on our hands." Zira felt her heart beat faster. This wasn't just any routine emergency. This was personal. And now, more than ever, she realized just how much she needed Ethan, because if anyone could get them out of this alive, it was him. The comms crackled again, the cold voice of Captain Allura coming through loud and clear. "Prepare to be boarded. Resistance will only make things more difficult." Ethan's jaw clenched as he glanced at the station's tactical display. The Shadows of Kira ship was closing in, its weapons already primed. They didn't have much time. "This is bad," Ethan muttered under his breath, his fingers dancing across the control panel. The shield systems were up, but he knew they wouldn't hold long against a sustained assault from a ship like the one approaching. Zira felt the same unease settle in her chest. She could sense the danger in the air, but more than that, she could feel the malicious intent of the enemy. The Shadows of Kira were known for their ruthless tactics. This wasn't just a threat, it was an invasion. "Can you hold the shields?" Zira asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension. Ethan didn't look up as he worked. "I'll try, but I'm not sure how long they'll last. We need to get the weapons online and prepare for a possible boarding. You handle the external systems and make sure we're ready to fight back." Zira nodded, her mind already working on the next steps. She couldn't let the Shadows of Kira take the station, not when they had fought so hard to survive in this part of space. The station shook again as the enemy ship fired a warning shot, the blast rattling the walls around them. Zira's heart raced, but she didn't hesitate. She ran down the corridor, heading toward the weapons bay. She could hear the sound of Ethan's steady footsteps behind her as he followed, but his focus remained on the shields. The weapons systems on the station were designed for long-range defense, but Zira knew they wouldn't be enough against an enemy ship like the one approaching. She had to get closer to the external weapons array to increase their power. As she reached the weapons control room, Zira quickly got to work, her mind moving quickly as she activated the targeting systems and adjusted the weapon's energy settings. The Shadows of Kira might have the advantage in firepower, but the station had something they didn't, a strong defense powered by the right adjustments and strategies. "Zira," Ethan's voice crackled over the comms, "I need you to get those weapons online now. We don't have much time." "I'm on it," Zira responded, her hands flying over the controls. The weapons systems hummed to life, their targeting reticles locking onto the enemy ship as it moved closer. But just as she was about to fire, the comms buzzed again, this time with a new message. It wasn't Captain Allura's voice, but something else, something unsettling. Zura. The voice was familiar, yet strained. Zura, it's me. Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was her brother, Soren, a member of the Velari resistance who had been lost during an earlier mission. He had disappeared months ago, and now, hearing his voice again, so unexpectedly, sent a rush of emotion through her. Soren, Zyra whispered, feeling a mix of relief and disbelief. Where are you? There was a moment of silence before the voice came through again. I'm on the shadows of Kira's ship. Listen to me, Zyra. They have control of the station's main systems. They've been tracking you. I tried to warn you, but you have to trust me. You have to stop the weapons before it's too late. Zyra's mind raced. How could her brother be on the enemy ship? And why had he waited until now to contact her? Was he telling the truth, or was this part of some larger trap? Stop the weapons, she asked, her voice shaking. What do you mean? I can't explain everything right now, but you need to disable the weapons systems. Trust me, it's the only way to prevent a massacre. They're planning something terrible, Zyra, something you can't stop if you fire on them. Her mind was spinning, but she didn't hesitate. She couldn't risk causing more destruction. Not when Soren's voice seemed so desperate. Ethan, she said into her comm, her voice urgent. We can't fire. We have to stop the weapons systems. My brother, he's on the shadows of Kira's ship. He says they're controlling everything. If we fire, we'll be walking right into their trap. There was a long pause before Ethan replied. Are you sure about this? You trust him? I have to, Zyra said, the words heavy with emotion. I can't take that risk. Ethan's voice was tight, but he didn't argue. All right, I'll do what I can to shut down the weapons, but we need to get out of here. Now, Zyra felt a chill run down her spine. If Soren was right, this wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a much larger conspiracy. And if they weren't careful, they would fall right into the enemy's hands. The sound of the enemy ship's engines grew louder, signaling their final approach. But Zyra knew what she had to do. She ran back to the control room, quickly relaying her instructions to Ethan as he worked to disable the weapons systems. Zyra, we're running out of time, Ethan said, his voice strained. They'll be here any second. I know, Zyra replied, her heart racing. But we have to be smart about this. We can't just fight blindly. I'll figure out a way to get to Soren. They could hear the docking clamps of the shadows of Kira's ship as it latched onto the station. Zyra's mind was a blur of thoughts. She couldn't trust her brother's words completely, but the emotion in his voice had felt real. And if there was even a chance that he was telling the truth, then they had to act carefully. The air around them seemed to grow heavier as the seconds ticked by. The shadows of Kira were boarding. They didn't have much time. The station trembled as the docking clamps of the shadows of Kira's ship latched firmly into place. Zyra's heart raced. She could hear the sound of the enemy's heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor, and every moment felt like it could be their last. She wasn't sure who was on the other side of the airlock, but one thing was certain. The shadows of Kira were coming, and they weren't planning on leaving without a fight. Ethan, she said, her voice tight, we have to make a choice. We can't just wait for them to take control of everything. I know, Ethan replied, his voice low. He was standing beside her, his eyes fixed on the control panel in front of him, trying to keep the station's systems from being completely overrun. The weapons systems had been disabled, but that was only one part of the equation. The shadows of Kira would not stop just because they couldn't fire. Zyra glanced at him, her mind filled with a mix of fear and determination. We need to find a way to get to Soren. If he's really on that ship and he's telling the truth, we can't afford to lose him again. Ethan nodded, though his expression was grim. "All right, but we can't go charging in without a plan. You're sure he's not being controlled? If we make a move, we need to be ready for anything." "Unsure," Zyra replied, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the weight of the decision hanging over her. The truth was, she wasn't sure about anything. But if there was even a chance that Soren was on the other side of that ship and could help them, she couldn't leave him behind. They quickly gathered their equipment, preparing to board the enemy ship. The doors to the docking bay hissed open, revealing the darkened corridor beyond. The air felt heavy with tension, but there was no turning back now. "Stay close," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "We need to move fast." Zyra nodded and followed him through the airlock, her pulse quickening as the hatch sealed behind them. They stepped into the unfamiliar, dimly lit corridor of the Shadows of Kira ship. The walls were cold and metallic, the lighting flickering in certain areas. Every step felt like it echoed in the silence, and the threat of danger was palpable. "Where do we go from here?" Zyra asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll get us to the control room," Ethan replied. "We need to access their systems and find out what's really going on. Soren's information is useful, but we can't trust him fully until we know more." Zyra's mind was in overdrive as they moved swiftly through the ship. She didn't want to doubt her brother, but something about this felt too dangerous, too calculated. The Shadows of Kira had been hunting them for too long, and now they were walking right into the heart of their enemy's territory. Every corner, every shadow could hold a threat. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small control room. Ethan quickly accessed the terminal, his hands moving with expert precision. The screen flickered before him, showing streams of data that flew past faster than Zyra could follow. "There," Ethan said, pointing to a series of coordinates. "This is where we need to go. It's close to where the docking bay connects to the main command center." Zyra took a deep breath, her mind racing. "If we're going to do this, it has to be now. We can't waste any more time." Without another word, they made their way toward the command center. As they approached, the sound of footsteps grew louder, and Zyra's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Someone was coming. Zyra motioned for Ethan to stop, and they ducked into a side hallway, holding their breath as the footsteps passed by. The silence in the corridor was deafening, and Zyra's grip tightened on the blaster at her side. When the threat had passed, they continued forward, more cautiously this time. The control room door was just ahead, and they could feel the tension building in the air. The last obstacle before they could find the truth. They reached the door, and Ethan swiftly unlocked it. The moment the door opened, they were met by a sight that froze them both in their tracks. Standing in front of them, with his arms crossed, was Soren. He looked exactly as Zyra remembered, same dark eyes, same familiar smile. But there was something different about him. His expression was colder, harder, as if he had been molded into something else during his time with the Shadows of Kira. "Soren," Zyra said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's really you." Soren's gaze flickered to Ethan before returning to her. "I know this must be hard to understand, Zyra," he said, his voice distant, "but I'm not here to hurt you." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then why are you with them? What are you really doing here?" Soren's expression remained unreadable. "I've been working with the Shadows of Kira to stop something far worse than you can imagine. You think this is just about the station, about me? No, it's about something much bigger." Zyra's mind was spinning. "What do you mean? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me?" "I didn't have a choice," Soren replied quietly. "I'm trying to stop a war. A war that will destroy everything you know if it's allowed to continue." The silence in the room was thick with tension. Zyra didn't know what to think. Her brother, the person she had trusted most in the universe, was now standing in front of her, a stranger in a dangerous place. But the pain in his eyes was real. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Soren," Zyra said, her voice soft but firm. "But I will listen. I want to understand. Help me stop this before it's too late." Soren nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "I'll tell you everything, but we need to act fast." As the weight of his words sank in, Zyra knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in their fight for survival. Together, they would face whatever was coming next, and they would need to trust each other like never before.